Hello and welcome to Friendship According to Humphrey by Betty G. Briney. I'm going to read chapter 1 with my friend Hayden. Hi Hayden.
Hi, Mrs. Dragus.
This is a story about everyone's favorite classroom pet. I am Mrs. Dragus and Hayden and I are going to read chapter 1. Let's look at the contents page, and chapter 1 is called Strange Change. Bump, bump, bump. Mrs. Brisbane and I were headed back to Longfellow School after the long winter holiday. But there were a lot more bumps in the road since the last time I rode in her small blue station wagon. Now, Humphrey, Mrs. Brisbane said. She was interrupted by another bump. Don't be surprised, bump. If there are a few changes, bump. In room 26, bump. My stomach felt slightly queasy as I hung on tightly to my ladder, so I had a hard time understanding what she was telling me. What did she mean by changes? While you were home with Bert, bump. I came back to school to get things all set. I was home with her husband Bert a lot over the holidays, and as much as I like him, I was worn out from running mazes a couple times a day. Mr. Brisbane loves to watch me run mazes. At least back in school I could catch 40 winks once in a while, and since I am a classroom hamster, I belong in the classroom. You know what 40 winks means, Hayden?
Yeah.
It means to take a nap. Yeah, it means to take a nap. My stomach calmed down a bit as Mrs. Brisbane pulled her car into a parking space. Now what about these changes, I asked, but it came out as squeak, 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 as usual. It's good to shake things up once in a while, Humphrey, Mrs. Brisbane assured me as she opened the car door. You'll see. I was already shaken up from the bumpy ride. Then a blast of icy wind made me shiver and I couldn't see a thing because Mrs. Brisbane had thrown a wool scarf over my cage. I didn't mind as long as I was on the way back to my classroom, where I'd seen all my friends again. Just thinking about them gave me a warm feeling. Or maybe it was the heat from the school furnace as we walked in the front door. Hi, Sue. Are we on for today? A familiar voice called out. I couldn't see Miss Loomis, but I recognized her voice. Miss Loomis taught a class down the hall. She was also Miss Brisbane's friend. Sure, Angie, how about after morning recess? See you then, said Miss Loomis. Finally, Miss Brisbane set my cage down in room 26 and removed the scarf. When she did, I was in for a shock. Something unsqueakable had happened in my classroom. For one thing, the tables faced the wrong direction. They used to point towards the front of the room. Now they were sideways. Instead of being arranged in neat rows like before, the tables were clumped together in groups. Mrs. Brisbane's desk had moved to the corner of the room. Pictures of people I'd never seen before replaced the happy snowmen that had covered the bulletin board in December. I was so dizzy from all the changes, I didn't notice the room filling up with "Lower your voice, AJ," yelled. "Hiya, Humphrey," as he came out of the cloakroom. Soon my other friends stopped by to say hi. "Did you have a nice vacation?" asked Miranda Golden. Miranda was an almost perfect human. That's why I think of her as Miranda Golden. My mother said to tell you hi. Speak up, Saya said in her sweet, soft voice. Hey, Humphrey Dumphrey, Garth shouted. That made Gail snicker, but I didn't mind. She laughed at everything. At that moment, the bell rang. Class, look for your names, and please take your seat now, Mrs. Brisbane said. There was a lot of thumping and bumping as my classmates loaded their new seats. Now I had a better view of some of the students who used to sit on the opposite side of the room. Like, don't complain, Mandy Payne. Sit still, Seth Stevenson. And I heard that, Kirk Chen. Maybe it's good to shake things up once in a while. Then I noticed something odd. There was a stranger in room 26, sitting near Shaya, Gale, and Kirk. Mrs. Brisbane, she doesn't belong here, I squeaked out loud. She's in the wrong room. Maybe Mrs. Brisbane didn't hear me. Class, as you can see, we're making some changes this year, and one of our changes is our brand new pupil, the teacher announced. Come here, Tabitha. The new girl seemed scared as she got up and stood next to Mrs. Brisbane. This is Tabitha Clark, and I want you to all welcome her. Tabitha, why don't you tell us something about yourself? The new girl looked down and shook her head. Mrs. Brisbane quickly turned back to the class. We'll do that later. Now, who would like to be in charge of showing Tabitha around today? Me, a voice called out. Of course, it was Raise Your Hand Heidi Hopper, who always forgets to raise her hand. Heidi, please. I think Mandy had her hand up first. Mandy, you will be Tabitha's buddy. I expect each of you to introduce yourself to Tabitha. Include her in your activities. She turned to the girl. I know you'll make a lot of friends in room 26. You may sit down now. The girl kept staring down at the floor as she returned to her seat. She looked as if she needed a friend. I was so busy watching her, I only half listened to what Mrs. Brisbane was saying. Was she really talking about poultry? After all, this is Longfellow School, she said, and I hope you know Henry Wadsworth Longfellow was a famous American poet. He did poetry.
Poetry.
Yeah, poetry. Nothing to do with chickens or turkeys, thank goodness, I have to admit. I'm a little scared of things with feathers, ever since my early days at Panorama. I still have nightmares about the day a large green parakeet escaped and flung himself at my cage, shrieking, "Yum, yum! Time to eat, Block!" He was still shrieking as Carl, the store clerk, carried him away. I heard that, clerk, said Mrs. Brisbane. Now I was saying much of this term will be spent reading and writing poetry. The groans were loud. I guess some people are afraid of poetry, even without feathers. Seth squirmed in his seat and pretended to pound his head on the table. Poetry, he moaned. Sit still, Seth, said Mrs. Brisbane. Sitting still wasn't easy for Seth. Now that he was practically right in front of me, I could see him wiggling and jiggling in his chair, which made Gail Morgenstern laugh. Stop giggling, Gail, Mrs. Brisbane warned. Gail stopped giggling and started hiccuping. Please go get a drink of water, Mrs. Brisbane told her. She turned to the new girl. Tabitha, please put that toy away. Everybody stared at Tabitha, including me. She was cradling a scruffy stuffed bear in her arms. The gray bear had cotton coming out of his ears and wore washed-out blue overalls with a button missing. Even his smile seemed a little faded. Now, please, said Mrs. Brisbane. It was quiet in the room, thank goodness. I'm afraid if Gail had been there, we would have heard peals of laughter and heaps of hiccups. Tabitha slid the shabby bear into the slot in her table without a word. Right then, Principal Morales marched through the door. Sorry for interrupting, Mrs. Brisbane. I just want to personally welcome you all back to school. The principal looked spiffy with a tie that had little pencils all over it. He always wore a tie because he was the most important person at Longfellow School. Thank you, Mr. Morales, said Mrs. Brisbane. We have a new student, Tabitha Clark, and a whole new setup for our class, as you can see. Welcome, Tabitha, said the principal. I'm sure you'll love it here in room 26. I'm glad to see that our friend Humphrey is back as well. He walked all the way across the classroom to my cage. Glad to see you, I squeaked in my loudest squeak. Hi, old pal, he greeted. He turned back to the rest of the class. You can all learn a lot from Humphrey, and I wish you a very successful semester. After he left, I turned my attention back to Tabitha. She was still staring straight down. I couldn't see her face clearly, but it was almost as red as her copper-colored hair. I guess I watched her a long time because suddenly the